This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and graphics. I'm Nick Manise. On today's program, we're taking a closer look at the earth beneath our feet. This is a special episode looking at clay. Writer Jennifer Lucy Allan delves into the human history of this ancient earthy substance. We visit the maker Bisila Noha at her London studio. Plus, Adam Weismann, co-founder of Clayworks, reflects on his journey working with the material. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. Hello and welcome to today's show, and welcome, to the microphone, this show's producer, Maylee Evans. Maylee, let's just cut to the chase. There's no secret. Everything needs to be out in the open. This is definitely an episode that you've pulled together. Tell us about your obsession with clay, and can I put pottery in there as well?
I think so. I thought, what better way to shoehorn my own interest into this programme than to dedicate a show to the material. I started pottery this time last year. And
it feels very New Year's resolution-y, doesn't it?
But what can I say? Through doing a course and then later doing drop-in sessions, it sort of garnered this curiosity about the material and also the breadth of ways that this particular practice comes up in the world. Every time you go to a museum, wherever you are, there will be sherds showing civilizations that have long ceased to be. But those fragments are maybe the only record of a people or of a way of living. And there's something about that connection to deep time, which I find really interesting. I'm excited about clay. I want everybody to understand clay in a slightly different way, hopefully by the end of today's programme.
I think that's a really astute point, but it's also such a strong reflection of a place. The fact that the very earth where something is or someone's from is then built into a building material, whether it's for pottery or structures and interiors, as we're going to hear later in the show, it instantly grounds it somewhere. And I think that's a big thing, that from furniture to architecture to, I guess, homewares, where we seem to be constantly looking for in our lives. People are always wanting something with a story, something that reflects where they are. And this kind of intrinsically does it.
So we're going to kick off maybe with a bit more of a holistic view to the material. So we're going to hear from Jennifer Lucy Allan. She's a music and culture writer, as well as a self-confessed amateur potter. She wanted to stress she is not a master at this. But I think that lends itself beautifully to the fact she's written a book, Clay, A Human History. It kind of brings together all these different lenses we might understand this material through. She got interested in the practice whilst researching a previous book and needed something that would get her out of her head, something tactile that would keep her brain active in a slightly different way. Got into pottery, found that on the bookshelves are all these instructional books that were very archaeological, historical. She wanted something that would bring together all these disparate places across the globe and give an insight into sort of the different ways in which clay can be understood. She interviews potters, musicians, poets. We go back and forth in history, looking at, the oldest figurines fashioned from clay, prehistoric ceramics in sub-Saharan Africa, to, conversations with a geochemist about clay found on Mars. So it's quite a range there.
Amazing. Well, let's hear from Jennifer now.
Working with clay allows you to do this kind of concertinaing of history. This became really present to me as I was doing the research, but also going into the community studio that I'm a part of and making bits of things, trying to replicate different processes or techniques. You realise when you're hand building in particular, the first thing that I did when I went into this studio in Leigh-on-Sea, the tutor, Madeline, gave me a lump of clay. She was like, "Have you ever done anything before?" I said, "No." She gave me a lump of clay and told me how to pinch a pot, which is kind of where you just get a fistful of clay, like a ball of clay, and you sink your thumb into it and then pinch it until you have a pot. And even within that minute or 2 minutes, this lump of earth turns into something that is a vessel that can hold water, basically. It's completely transformed. And that form of making with no tools, with just the hands, always very basic tools like bits of wood or something, that is a method of making that goes back into prehistory, 20,000 years or more. 20,000 years is about the earliest vessel we have. We have figurines from earlier. I'm sat there in 2024 pinching a pot, and it's exactly the same gesture as somebody did in 20,000 years ago. You're instantly very close to that prehistoric human. We have not evolved in any major ways, physically. Our hands are the same, our brains are the same. The creative decisions you're making are the same. When people pinch a pot, because it's a record of your gestures, they're all slightly different. You can become very close to that really ancient, prehistoric human. But then at the same time, there's literally the entire history of humanity in between you and everything that's ever been made of clay.
One of the chapters in the book is about architecture and some of, I suppose, the creatives who've considered this very humble material to be something we could be much more expansive with.
I got interested in looking at a few radical architects who wanted to make entire houses from fired clay. You often get raw mud houses in various traditions throughout history, but there was an Iranian architect called Nader Khalili, and then an American guy who went to India and set up a pottery called Ray Meeker. Ray found Nader's book and decided to take the research further, and actually was more successful. But they were building these giant pots that you could live in, conceptually speaking. Ray built, a lot of the things he built were in Auroville, which is the radical community in India, and he built a house that he thinks is still standing that has a 5-metre high dome. And so you set up the house like it's a kiln. So you build it and then you fill it with bricks to complete the build, and then you fire it. And it's a really inefficient firing. But Nader wrote this incredible memoir that's out of print. He wanted to make zero-cost, earthquake-resistant housing for the rural poor in Iran. He wanted to do this by using the earth and firing it. And he had all these visions of turning the desert into these glittering shell roofs, all glazed and beautiful. Once I'd done all that research and was thinking about these kind of visions of completely different ways to live, houses that offer totally different forms than we're used to.
And so we've talked about architecture, but I wondered about the cities and towns, areas that have been really impacted by the presence of clay. I'm thinking the ceramics industry. Tell me about some of the places you visited whilst researching for this book and the ways in which clay has had a very visceral and clear impact on the built environment.
Once I'd sort of thought about the architecture in terms of our immediate built environment, then I started thinking about, what happens when we think about this in a bigger way? What happens when it's an entire city? What happens when it's an industry? And there are all these connections, and it ended up being a sort of profile of Tokoname in Japan and Stoke. Most countries or regions have an area which specialises in a certain sort of ceramics. And I was interested in Tokoname because it was such a centre of production in pottery, and it's now been regenerated into quite a sort of touristy pottery town where you visit, but there are a lot of individual makers, a lot of studio potters there. So you walk through these tiny streets. There's just countless little studios where people are working and they're selling stuff, and they've got a wheel in the corner and then all their stuff on shelves, and you just go shopping there, and it's amazing because they made a lot of industrial ceramic products, pipes and bottles and things like that for a period when Japan was being modernised and a lot of infrastructure was being built. Then actually you go shopping in these little streets and it's all really lovely. But then actually when you look around you, the entire landscape is built on this as well. There's all these little kiln chimneys that you can see on this quite a steep incline, and you can see all these chimneys sticking out over the landscape. And some of the streets, there's a street that gets photographed a lot. It's kind of a narrow street down the side of a steep bank, and the bank is completely built from pipes and bottles. There's the presence of this material in these really immediate ways. We can say Tokoname was built on clay, but it literally is built from clay as well. And I was kind of interested in how that manifests when you're kind of walking around. One of the things I was interested in Stoke was to think about how does this seep into social or political or religious ideas that sit in this place. Stoke is a place about which a huge amount has been written, especially about Wedgwood. But I started going to ask okay, so how did people think about clay in Stoke when they were the factory workers. The sort of like ethical principles around business at certain times, but also the way that potters really had this idea that in the Bible, Adam is formed from clay or earth, depending on your translation. And so potters felt they were like very close to that Genesis story in the Bible when they were working there. And there is some evidence to suggest that in various newspaper articles.
I mean, this book is an excellent primer for those new to clay and ceramics to learn about various sort of traditions across the world. What do you hope that readers take away?
You can get really focused when you're making with clay, like on one thing, and kind of maybe forget about the bigger picture. But thinking about how profound some of this stuff is. There's so many Genesis stories that have humans made from clay. And thinking about that, really being conscious of that when you're making, or even when you're like drinking a cup of tea in the morning. And this is something I think applies to a lot of my writing, is like this idea of re-enchanting the world around you just by learning a bit more about what this thing means or where it's come from or who made it. What ideas are contained within this object, what its history is, and how it can give you like a window onto a lot of other histories or times or places. And that feels really exciting to me. And mostly just for people to like really have a look at what's in their house and be like, wow, this material's all around me.
That was Jennifer Lucy Allan there. Clay, A Human History is published by White Rabbit Books and is available at all good bookstores now. Mei-Li, where are we next, I guess, on this journey?
We're staying in London for the moment and visiting the studio of Bisila Noha. She's a half Spanish, half Equatorial Guinean artist. She works predominantly in clay, but has worked with plaster previously as well, so is interested in experimenting with material there. But I first came across her work at Collect, that's the contemporary craft and design fair held at Somerset House annually, and was really struck by the vessels that are on display, fashioned from terracotta. But they just have this dynamic sort of movement, and I just thought they were wonderful pieces, and I thought, right, at some point we're going to get her onto this show, and today is that day.
Her work almost looks like a Zaha Hadid concert hall or something like that. These forms that, you know, I guess you could start with something kind of spherical, but they seem to jut out and pull out at all these almost gravity-defying angles. And I think that's what I'm excited to hear about in this conversation. I mean, the beauty of a material like clay and a discipline like pottery is its ability to kind of blur that boundary between art and design. It is functional, but it also, I guess, it brings out certain emotions in us. Like in this case, reminds me of outstanding architecture that I love. Why don't we dive into your chat with Bisila Noha now?
Tell me about the importance of movement in your work. You've got a collection of vessels, primus, inspired by an African-American choreographer, Pearl Eileen Primus. How do you create some of these works that do seem to defy the laws of nature?
With all of my work is the idea of movement. I've always wanted to give my pieces that sense of aliveness, that people either, if it's more 2D, that they need to spend time looking at it to feel it and to understand what might be happening, or else like more 3D work, like to walk around it, to see the whole thing and interact with it. 2 years ago, there was a lot of exhibitions around textile, and I found the quality of it compared to the static nature of clay, really, very appealing. And then also from going to contemporary dance, and then that took me a bit into a rabbit hole of looking into like dances and the politics of it and the ethnographic or anthropological part of some of them, which is very much in line with my own work. I was like, I wish I could bring this to my pieces and feel as if the piece is dancing. My gallery is Claire here in London. 2 years ago, I was like, okay, for the next thing, you're going to focus on a shape. She gave me that brief, so you can do whatever you want to the shape, but let's make something cohesive. A shape that I really love, which relates to the traditional containers of water, grain. I feel like is a grounding element to it, to the history of pottery and to the women makers. Once the shape is built, it's just like opening it, like flopping the clay and allowing also the pieces to a degree, because then there's lots of disasters, to fall, to lose balance. Adding to my work is just like ridges of clay and like my fingers, and definitely holes, and then that sense of a spaciousness and like being able to see through that depth to the pieces.
Your journey into clay was maybe not a traditional path. Before you took to the wheel, you were a translator. I wondered how this background has impacted your approach to the craft.
Well, to be a translator, I had to study languages, and through that, like living in different places, go to where the languages come from, study the culture and the history. It's like an immersion into a different culture. I have the same interest and therefore approach when it comes to clay, because I love going to different places, generally more remote, that make quote-unquote more traditionally, to try to see and understand and feel like how, like the history of the practice, especially with clay, understanding the importance of what we're doing when we work with clay or any craft, I would say, is a really long history, and we're part of that lineage. That is a way of honoring it and feeling like that I belong to it and that I do it in a way that is in line with all of those stories and all of those people.
There was a project where you were unearthing the histories of unnamed potters, where they fit in this lineage. Why was it really important for you to focus on them and maybe not those big names that are always getting exhibitions?
It started like in a way by chance. I was working on a project that it was about my own identity in mixed race and using clays from my dad's home village in Equatorial Guinea. And then I was looking for the shapes for the projects, and I was looking at the wider African continent. And then I saw one piece, which I thought like the shape was perfect. I was very biased and I had a lot of assumptions when I looked at it, and I was also like doing it very superficially. So I missed the fact that actually there was a woman behind this piece. And I realized, and what struck me or angered me beyond my own stupidity, I'm going to say, is that like it was with the photo there was no information about the woman other than her name. And that's where like the unnamed women of clay comes from, because there's so many. So even if I was focusing on this particular woman, she to me represented all of these other women that not only in the history of pottery, in the history of art, in history in general, because of who has studied, documented, and decided what it is important and is in museums and is in history books, we've missed so much. It's also important from a personal level because this tends to be women of color. Being a woman of color today, doing certain things, it can feel lonely because there's no role models. We're not going to be able to name them all because then the list is endless. But to have that awareness of like, we don't come out of nowhere. Actually, we've built this world one way or other, and that makes us feel unstoppable, and to be able to make sense of ourselves and our own existence today, regardless of what society might say we are.
You said previously that your practice questions what the design world, in quotation marks, deem worthy of attention or spending time with. How is this done through your work?
I would say the techniques in one way, and how I mix, I'm going to say the good and the bad, right? So like throwing and hand building, or like the clays. I like working with terracotta now because generally you don't see that in like art spaces, and also like no glazes, so you can really see the clay in itself. Another project that I have is just mixing the clay, I'm going to say from the global south, with clays like porcelain, this thing that everybody loves. Consciously choosing the materials and the way I work with them so that the narrative or that concept is embedded in the objects that I'm making.
That was the artist Bisila Noha there. We'll be back in just a moment.
Tune in to Monocle on Culture, where we grill our panel of critics to get the inside line on the best in the world of film, music, art, literature and more.
It's just got this synth section that kind of makes you want to swing through the saloon doors straight to the dance floor.
With industry insiders and the odd bit of reportage too, it's bound to keep the most discerning of culture vultures very well fed.
Why'd You Come In Here Looking Like That is a song that is absolutely going to make you want to put on a pair of tight jeans and go boot scooting, even if it's just in your front room.
Monocle on Culture, premiering Mondays at 2000 London time and available thereafter wherever you get your podcasts.
Finally on today's program, now we've hinted at it at the top of the show with Jennifer, but this idea of using clay as a building material, something more than just pottery, but actually the walls, the structures that surround us, is what we're going to dive into next. Maylee Evans, where are we going?
Cornwall, I suppose. I spoke to Adam Weismann. He's a co-founder at Clayworks, and this is a company that specialises in natural plaster finishes. Adam's journey with clay has developed significantly. So he started off building structures. He did an apprenticeship years ago with his wife in Oregon on the west coast of America, building with clay, unprocessed wood, stone. There was no intention of starting a business at that point. It was just an interest in learning how to use the land to build their own home at that moment in time. And this has developed over the years. They've written a book about building with cob. In more recent years, has shifted somewhat into finding ways for clay to be introduced into maybe more contemporary and modern contexts. Clayworks is looking at ways to bringing that natural material into, say, hospitality, into hotels.
Yeah, and essentially, I guess, in using it at perhaps unexpected scales and in unexpected locations. And I think that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing about this conversation. It's this idea, innovative new materials that are environmentally friendly, that let us build a little bit better, a little bit more in harmony with the environment. So often it's about, recycling things or developing something, but ultimately this is an incredibly environmentally friendly material. It's incredibly healthy for the people that are living in amongst it. It does that thing that we talked about at the top of the show in terms of grounding a structure with a sense of place, which is something that we're also looking for. But then obviously there are all the benefits to it. Clay is renowned for its energy efficiency. You see it used where it can be a very cooling material. And I think that's why it's so exciting that what's going on with Clayworks is this need to push alternative. It's weird to call clay an alternative material.
I know, but I think that's precisely it. And even in the conversation, we were saying, at first there were skeptics going, do you want to bring clay in the indoors? Okay. Perhaps now the tide has shifted.
Brilliant. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing that unpacked in this conversation. Let's hear from Adam Weismann now.
I've always loved avian architecture, so I've always loved birds' nests. And so in terms of swallows building their own nests, studying that and looking at how they use straw, they use clay, they use twigs, but predominantly clay and straw. And for me, what sums up my love of clay and building with clay is the idea of like a bird uses its breast to actually build out the inside of the walls of their nest, and so they're actually physically using their body. And the idea of them putting their own heartbeat, their own piece of themselves into the building, that's how I look at clay, and being able to, from a human perspective, being able to do that with one's hands.
In those early days where you were building these structures, you published a book, Building with Cob.
Mm-hmm.
For those unfamiliar with cob, could you explain a little bit about what makes it such a good material?
Cob is a mixture of clay, subsoil, straw, and aggregates. And that's really all that it is. It's just blended all together. And in England, we've got a vernacular tradition of cob houses, predominantly in the southwest, but really all over England. And really every country in the world has its own tradition of earthen building. But cob specifically is more of a term used in the southwest of England. Cob, that's what my wife Katie and I started out building with, and we started restoring old buildings, and we started building new ones too out of cob. We spent a good 10 years doing that and really getting into designing buildings as well out of cob and straw bale, and we started creating our finishes from that. Yeah.
And maybe talk me through that journey, because you're going from those entire structures to those surface finishes. What was that realization in thinking, what if we tried working with this material in a slightly different way?
I think it was the fact that we were digging up the clay from on site to actually do our own clay finishes. And so for our clients that we were building the walls for, or structures or whatever it might have been, we're actually digging up the clay from on site and then making our own clay finishes from the material on site. It was a wonderful experience, and we wrote a book too about using clay and lime finishes. And so we're able to travel the world really and learn from different master plasterers and master builders for a good 2 years. And that really changed both my perspective and my wife Katie's perspective too, in terms of thinking about how we can get this out into the more modern world. And so instead of this being a very traditional material only being used on traditional buildings, thinking about it more of a contemporary material being used in contemporary buildings. And that took some effort and some education, and a lot of people thought that we were bonkers. Why would you want to put clay on the walls? But it took some refining of the finishes to really speak to our clients and speak to the design world. It was really through digging up the material and seeing how labor intensive it was, and the time that it took to actually make up the mixes. It was very expensive to do that. And so we thought, okay, let's try and create a mix that's very easy for people to use, and all you have to do is just add water to it, and you can create any color or texture instead of being the material that is just directly beneath your feet.
The properties of this plaster aren't only aesthetic, they also can contribute to an environment. And I think often on this programme we talk about healthy buildings and how you can facilitate an environment which is keeping you from getting sick and contributing to that. So I wondered if you could share some of the properties of these plasters and how it manages to sort of help facilitate that.
Unfired clay, it's a magical material. It's incredible when used in a building context. With finishes specifically, unfired clay, our clay plasters are able to actually absorb excess condensation. And so when you've got a lot of condensation in the room, the pore structure of the clay is able to actually absorb that. And then when the humidity level goes down to a healthy level, it desorbs it. And so it puts it back in the atmosphere. So it's this magical regulator. And that's not what we've created with our plasters. It's what clay does in itself, really. So that's one example. In terms of chemicals as well, a lot of building materials have got a lot of chemicals actually added into it, and that's something that we're really proud of. Is we don't have any additives in it. We don't use any type of polymers or anything like that. We're quite purist when it comes to that.
I guess when you first embarked on this project, there are some skeptics, but have you seen in your time working with this material a sort of shift in the tide?
It's certainly changed. When we first started our business in 2010 with the finishes, no one really knew about clay plasters as a finish. And so it was really a process of educating. And so there was a lot of skeptics at first, and it took a good couple of years to break through into the market. And then once we got our first restaurant project, that's when the architecture and design community really took note, and people started thinking, oh, we could use that as an alternative finish to, for example, micro cement or a cement-based finish or a gypsum-based plaster.
I've seen some examples of how these plasters have been used, and there's a real range in texture and depth and just what you can do with it. What have been for you some of the more exciting or inventive ways that people have taken this starting point and then been imaginative with it?
We did a project called Walmer Yard in Notting Hill, and that was with Peter Salter and Fenella Collingbridge. That was a really interesting project. He uses a lot of Japanese inspiration in his design. He came to us wanting to use clay in a very, I guess you call it brutalist in terms of architecture. And I love the juxtaposition of this soft material, this nature being brought into this heavy concrete clad structure, and it works really well. And that really switched a light for me in terms of seeing the way that his vision really of seeing how the two would blend together. We've created a finish called arakabe, which for this particular project we use black, and so it's like a charcoal black color of clay with straw, and the gold flecks within the black clay really worked in that context. That was a really good example of working with an architect who had real vision too. We went through multiple sampling processes, and he really wanted a certain color, and so he had certain color references that he was going after. So I think we did 35 different colors to get the color just right. But it was worth it because in the end it really worked well. Looking forward,
what is exciting you? Or if you can share, what are you looking forward to exploring further?
The possibilities are endless, really, with clay. And for me, I really enjoy like a creative approach. And so I'm sort of coming full circle in terms of why I first got involved with clay, and that was because I really like the hands-on nature of it. I love the colors and the textures and creating shapes and patterns. I've created new artwork. I'm calling it Clay Moon. And so I'm creating artwork predominantly for the hospitality industry, but also for private clients, which is really exciting to explore those different avenues of the material and the textures, and also joining other materials into it too. I'm using some stones and fossils and some crystals as well.
That was Adam Weismann there, co-founder of Clayworks.
And that's all for today's show. For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was hand-thrown or produced and edited by Maylee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.